January 15th, 1943, 0820 hours. Outside Voronezh, Soviet Union. Sergeant Ivan Petrov watched German shells impact around his Valentine Mark III, each explosion throwing frozen earth and snow into the air. His tank shuddered as a round struck the glacis plate, a solid hit that should have penetrated and killed everyone inside the cramped turret. Instead, the shell ricocheted off with a ringing impact that left Petrov's ears screaming but left the armor intact. "British steel," his gunner muttered, traversing the turret toward the German anti-tank position. "They said these were toys. Doesn't feel like a toy." The Valentine's 2-pounder gun fired, its report sharp in the frozen air. The shot struck the German position, and the enemy gun fell silent. Petrov ordered advance, and the Valentine's diesel engine, an AEC unit built in England, responded smoothly despite temperatures that had frozen Soviet T-34s solid in their positions. The little British tank moved forward at its characteristic slow pace, tracks gripping the snow, heading toward the next defensive position his platoon had been ordered to secure. Around him, other Valentines from his company were similarly engaged, small, ungainly tanks that looked obsolete compared to the sleek T-34s or the massive German Tigers. But the Valentines worked. They started reliably in cold that disabled other vehicles. Their simple systems required minimal maintenance. Their armor, while thin by contemporary standards, was well designed and more effective than its specifications suggested. And their crews had learned that what the Valentine lacked in firepower or speed, it compensated for through sheer stubborn reliability. Petrov had been skeptical when his unit received Valentines in summer 1942, replacing the light tanks they'd lost during the German advance. The British tanks seemed like poor substitute, smaller than Soviet tanks, more lightly armed, clearly obsolete by modern standards. But 9 months of combat had changed his assessment completely. The Valentine had kept him alive through battles that destroyed more impressive-looking vehicles. It had functioned in conditions that defeated supposedly superior tanks. It had proven that reliability mattered more than impressive specifications, that a tank that always worked served better than a tank that worked better but often didn't work at all. The desperate offering. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Soviet tank forces were devastated through combination of tactical surprise, German tactical superiority, and Soviet organizational failures. Thousands of Soviet tanks were destroyed or abandoned in the first months of Operation Barbarossa. Soviet tank production, while substantial, couldn't immediately replace these losses, particularly as German advances captured or threatened major industrial centers. By autumn 1941, the Soviet Union faced critical shortage of armored vehicles at a moment when armor was essential for both defense and any hope of counterattack. Britain's commitment to aid the Soviet Union was political and strategic. Keeping the Soviet Union fighting meant Germany would face two-front war, reducing pressure on Britain. But providing meaningful military aid was complicated by Britain's own equipment needs and by logistical challenges of delivering supplies to Soviet forces. Aircraft could be flown via Persia or provided to Soviet crews for delivery via Arctic route. Other equipment required shipping through dangerous waters where German U-boats and aircraft threatened convoys. Tanks presented particular challenge because they were heavy, bulky, and Britain itself needed every tank it could produce for North African campaigns and home defense. But British tank production, by late 1941, exceeded immediate British requirements, particularly for Valentine tanks, which weren't ideal for British doctrine, but which were being produced in quantity because the design was simple and used automotive components readily available. The Valentine had been designed in 1938 as private venture by Vickers Armstrong, intended as simple, reliable infantry support tank that could be produced quickly using existing automotive components. The British Army had ordered it somewhat reluctantly, preferring more sophisticated designs, but had accepted Valentines in quantity because they could be produced rapidly while better tanks were being developed. By 1941, approximately 1,000 Valentines had been built, with production continuing at multiple factories. The tanks were adequate but unimpressive by British standards. The armor, maximum 60 millimeters on early marks, was modest. The gun, initially a 2-pounder, later upgraded to 6-pounder, was barely adequate against German armor. The speed, maximum 15 miles per hour, was slow even by infantry tank standards. The crew space was cramped, particularly with 3-man crews standard on early marks. British tank crews generally viewed Valentines as acceptable but inferior to Matildas or Churchills for assault operations. But Valentines had advantages that British assessment didn't fully appreciate. The automotive components, diesel engines, commercial transmission, simple suspension, were extremely reliable. The low profile made Valentines harder to spot and hit than taller designs. The armor, while thin, was well sloped and more effective than thickness alone suggested. The mechanical simplicity meant Valentines required less maintenance than more sophisticated tanks. For Soviet use, these characteristics proved more valuable than British evaluations suggested. The frontline reality, combat experience, rapidly changed Soviet assessment of Valentine tanks from skeptical to appreciative, as their reliability proved decisive advantage. The first Soviet units to receive Valentines deployed them cautiously, uncertain of their capabilities. But immediate observations were positive. The Valentine's diesel engine started reliably in cold weather that caused problems for Soviet gasoline engines. The automotive components required minimal maintenance compared to Soviet tanks with more sophisticated but less reliable systems. The low profile made Valentines difficult targets. The armor, while thin by specification, was well designed and resisted penetration better than thickness alone suggested. Soviet crews adapted their tactics to Valentine's characteristics. The tank wasn't suitable for aggressive armored charges, it was too slow and undergunned. But it excelled in defensive operations, where its reliability and low profile were advantages. Valentines would dig into defensive positions, using terrain for additional protection, engaging German armor at ranges where their modest guns were adequate. The tactic minimized Valentine's weaknesses while exploiting its reliability and protection. The Battle of Moscow in winter 1941 to 1942 saw early Valentine deployments where their cold weather reliability proved decisive. Soviet counteroffensives required tanks that would function in extreme cold. T-34s, while superior in most respects, had reliability problems in severe cold. Engines wouldn't start, transmissions froze, systems failed. Valentines, with their simple automotive components and diesel engines, started and operated when other tanks failed. Soviet commanders learned that Valentine's unglamorous reliability made it more valuable in winter operations than more impressive tanks that wouldn't start. The pattern repeated throughout 1942 and 1943. Valentines participated in every major Soviet operation, usually in supporting roles rather than primary assault forces, but their participation was enabled by reliability that allowed them to reach battlefields and function once they arrived. German reports noted British tanks in Soviet service with mixture of confusion and respect. Confusion because sophisticated German intelligence hadn't expected Soviet forces to use supposedly obsolete British equipment. Respect because those British tanks kept appearing in battles despite German efforts to destroy Soviet armor. Kursk and Beyond. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 saw Valentines participating in largest tank battle of the war, demonstrating their sustained value despite being clearly obsolete by contemporary standards. Soviet forces at Kursk included Valentines in defensive positions throughout the salient. The British tanks occupied dug-in positions, their low profiles making them difficult targets, their reliable engines ensuring they'd be operational when German attacks came. The battle's enormous scale, approximately 6,000 Soviet tanks versus 3,000 German tanks, meant that individual Valentine contributions were modest, but their participation demonstrated that Soviet forces continued valuing British tanks even as Soviet production of T-34s and heavy tanks accelerated. German forces at Kursk encountered Valentines among the defensive positions they assaulted. German after-action reports noted British tanks in Soviet service, sometimes identifying them correctly, sometimes confusing them with Soviet designs. The reports acknowledged that British tanks, while not formidable by German standards, were effectively employed in Soviet defensive doctrine and contributed to defensive success that defeated German offensive. After Kursk, Soviet forces shifted to sustained offensive operations that gradually pushed German forces westward. Valentines continued serving in Soviet units through 1944 and into 1945, though their numbers declined as Soviet tank production provided T-34s and heavy tanks in quantities sufficient to equip all formations. Some Valentines served until Germany's final defeat, participating in battles across Eastern Europe and into Germany itself. The longevity was remarkable for tank design that had been considered obsolete when it entered production. Valentines outlasted many more sophisticated designs because their reliability and mechanical simplicity allowed them to continue operating when complex tanks were disabled by mechanical failures or battle damage that exceeded field repair capabilities. The unglamorous virtues of reliability and simplicity proved more valuable than impressive specifications that couldn't be sustained under combat conditions. The Arctic Passage. Delivering Valentine tanks to Soviet forces required hazardous Arctic convoy operations through waters dominated by German air and naval forces. The primary route for British aid to Soviet Union ran from British ports to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk in Soviet Arctic. The convoys faced multiple threats: German U-boats operating from Norwegian bases, Luftwaffe bombers with short flight times to convoy routes, German surface raiders, including battleship Tirpitz, that threatened to sortie against convoys. The Arctic environment added natural hazards, storms, ice, cold that could disable equipment and kill exposed personnel. Valentine tanks were loaded as deck cargo on merchant ships, their weight making them impossible to stow below decks on most vessels. The tanks were weatherproofed as much as possible, engines preserved, hatches sealed, exposed components protected, but Arctic conditions were brutal. Salt spray froze on metal surfaces. Ice accumulated on decks, making ships top-heavy and unstable. Temperatures well below freezing persisted even during summer months. The convoy losses were substantial. PQ-17, in July 1942, lost 24 of 35 merchant ships to German attacks, with substantial loss of tanks and other cargo. Other convoys suffered severe casualties that made each delivery uncertain. But enough convoys reached Soviet ports to deliver thousands of British tanks, approximately half of all Valentines produced during the war. Soviet reception of British tanks was initially skeptical. Soviet tank designers favored heavy armor and powerful guns, viewing lightly armed British tanks as inadequate. The Valentine's 2-pounder gun was clearly inferior to Soviet 76.2mm weapons. The armor was thinner than T-34s. The speed was slower. Soviet officers examining newly delivered Valentines saw tanks that appeared obsolete by Soviet standards, delivered because British Army didn't want them, rather than because they were actually useful. The Soviet adaptation. Soviet forces modified Valentine employment to suit their tactical doctrine while appreciating the tank's characteristics that British forces undervalued. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized massed armor assaults supported by artillery and infantry. Valentines weren't ideal for this role. They were too slow for rapid exploitation, too lightly armed for armor versus armor combat. But Soviet commanders integrated Valentines into operations by employing them in roles where their characteristics were advantages rather than limitations. Defensive operations utilized Valentines extensively. Their low profile made them effective in prepared positions. Their reliability meant they'd be operational when needed. Their armor, while modest, was adequate against German weapons at defensive ranges. Soviet defensive doctrine employed tanks as mobile anti-tank reserves, moving to threatened sectors and establishing firing positions to defeat German attacks. Valentines excelled in this role through combination of reliability that ensured they'd reach positions and protection that allowed them to survive long enough to be effective. Infantry support operations used Valentines to provide direct fire support for advancing Soviet infantry. The tanks would advance with infantry formations, engaging German positions with their guns and machine guns, using armor protection to enable infantry to close with German defenses. The Valentine's modest firepower was adequate for suppressing infantry and destroying field fortifications. Its reliability meant it would be available when infantry needed support, rather than being disabled by mechanical failure. Some Soviet forces outgunned Valentines by removing British 2-pounder or 6-pounder weapons and installing Soviet 76.2mm guns. The modification created hybrid vehicles that combined British reliability with Soviet firepower preferences. The conversions were unofficial field modifications rather than systematic programs, reflecting Soviet willingness to adapt equipment to their needs rather than using it exactly as designed. Soviet crews developed genuine appreciation for Valentines despite their modest capabilities. Interviews and reports consistently mentioned reliability. The Valentine started when other tanks didn't, ran when other tanks broke down, required minimal maintenance compared to Soviet designs. The simplicity was valued. Repairs could be accomplished with basic tools by crews without specialized training. The protection was respected. Valentines survived hits that should have been fatal, their well-designed armor providing better protection than thickness alone suggested. The recognition. Soviet assessment of British tanks, particularly Valentines, evolved from skeptical to genuinely appreciative as combat experience demonstrated their value. Official Soviet reports during the war were carefully worded to avoid excessive praise of Western equipment. Soviet propaganda emphasized Soviet achievements and minimized dependence on Allied aid. But internal assessments and post-war historical analysis acknowledged that British tanks, particularly Valentines, made substantial contributions during critical periods when Soviet tank production couldn't meet requirements. Soviet tank crews' personal assessments were more direct. Interviews conducted during and after the war consistently praised Valentine reliability. Crews mentioned that Valentines started in cold weather, required less maintenance than Soviet tanks, and were easy to repair when damaged. The appreciation wasn't based on Valentine being superior tank overall. Soviet crews recognized that T-34 was better tank in most respects, but on Valentine being reliably available when needed, which made it valuable despite its limitations. Post-war Soviet military histories acknowledged Lend-Lease contributions more openly than wartime propaganda had permitted. Valentine tanks were noted as significant component of Soviet armor strength during 1942 to 1943, filling critical gaps while Soviet production recovered from German invasion's disruptions. The assessments recognized that without British and American tank deliveries, Soviet forces would have faced German armor with substantially fewer tanks of their own during a period when numerical advantage was essential for defensive success. British awareness of Valentine's Soviet service was limited during the war. British forces in North Africa and Italy used Valentines but generally viewed them as adequate but unexceptional tanks. The Soviet experience, where Valentine's reliability proved decisive advantage, wasn't fully communicated to British designers or military leadership. Post-war, as information about Soviet employment became available, British appreciation of Valentine's strengths increased. Recognizing that characteristics British had undervalued proved critically important under Soviet operating conditions. The final accounting. The Valentine tank's contribution to Allied victory was substantial but often overlooked in histories that focused on more dramatic equipment or operations. The statistics documented massive British industrial effort. 8,275 Valentines produced between 1940 and 1944. Approximately 45% delivered to Soviet forces, with smaller numbers going to other Allied nations. The production represented significant commitment of British industrial capacity to producing tanks for export when Britain itself needed every tank it could build. The Soviet employment statistics were equally impressive. Approximately 3,800 Valentines delivered through hazardous Arctic convoys and Persian corridor, equipping substantial portion of Soviet armor forces during critical 1942-1943 period. The tanks participated in every major Soviet operation from Moscow through Berlin, serving in roles that utilized their reliability while minimizing their limitations. The combat effectiveness is harder to quantify precisely. Valentines weren't decisive weapons that won battles through their capabilities. They were adequate tanks that contributed to Soviet forces' numerical advantage and operational reliability. But adequate contributions delivered reliably often matter more than superior capabilities delivered inconsistently. Valentine's sustained availability throughout critical period meant Soviet commanders could plan operations knowing that British tanks would be operational when needed, providing foundation of reliable armor that allowed Soviet operations to proceed. The human cost included British merchant seamen who died delivering Valentines through Arctic convoys, Soviet tank crews who fought in Valentines despite knowing they were outgunned by German armor, British factory workers who produced tanks for unknown Soviet crews fighting in unknown locations. The collective effort represented Allied cooperation that transcended national boundaries and political systems, united by common goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Ivan Petrov survived the war, returning to his village in Ukraine with medals earned through 3 years of combat in Valentine tanks. When asked years later about his service, he spoke of the British tank with genuine appreciation. It wasn't the best tank. The T-34 was faster, stronger, better armed. But the Valentine always worked. In the coldest winter, when nothing else would start, the Valentine started. When we had no spare parts and no time for repairs, the Valentine kept running. It wasn't heroic or impressive. It was just reliable. And reliability kept us alive when impressive specifications couldn't. That assessment captured Valentine's essential contribution: unglamorous reliability that mattered more than impressive capabilities, sustained availability that served better than sporadic superiority, simple persistence that contributed to victory through sheer, stubborn refusal to fail. The Tin Can tank had held the Eastern Front not through dramatic combat achievements, but through being reliably present when Soviet forces needed armor, functioning when more sophisticated tanks failed, continuing to serve long after it should have been obsolete. That was Britain's contribution to Soviet survival and eventual victory. Not the best tank, but tanks that always worked, delivered in thousands when they were desperately needed, providing foundation of reliable armor that helped Soviet forces survive Germany's onslaught and eventually defeat it.